In the middle of a bustling New York airport, a smartly dressed black woman, first-class ticket in hand, boarded the plane with a calm smile. But just a few minutes later, that smile disappeared when a gate agent stopped her, coldly saying, "This seat is not yours. Please go to economy class," without a curse, without a violent reaction. She simply looked the woman straight in the eye and asked, "Why?" The reason she gave was reasonable. The seat was double booked, but no one in the compartment believed it was a coincidence, because the person waiting for seat 3A was a white man, wearing an expensive watch, with a more first-class appearance. Little did they know, the woman being disrespected was more than just a passenger. She was an undercover inspector for the Federal Transportation Security Administration, FTSA, the agency that had the power to investigate and find the airline. And from that seemingly small act, a chain of events exposed prejudice, abuse of power, and the true value of respect. So, what happened when the person who got kicked out of her seat turned out to be a representative of federal justice, and what made an entire airline bow down to a woman they despised? If you love stories about justice, dignity, and courage, please share this video, and subscribe to the channel to join us on the surprising journey of the woman in seat 3A. The terminal window reflected Naomi Carter's face in a thin layer of determination. She stood there in the middle of the crowd at New York Liberty International, Terminal 4, in a charcoal gray pantsuit, barely shined black shoes, and a gaze cold enough to make anyone who looked at her flinch for half a second. In her hand was a first-class ticket, Seat 3A, Atlantic Star Airlines, Flight AS-472 to Los Angeles Pacific International, LAPI. To outsiders, she was just a VIP passenger, a successful businesswoman on a business trip. But behind that silence, Naomi was carrying out a mission that no one in this terminal could guess. She was an undercover inspector for the Federal Transportation Oversight Agency, FTOA, which monitors discrimination in the airline industry. She wasn't on any official list, and no one at the airline knew she was there. Over the past 3 months, FTOA has received dozens of reports of the same type of incident: passengers of color being subjected to extra scrutiny when checking in first class, having their seats changed without reason, or being suspected of fraudulent tickets when everything is in order. The incidents are small, but repeated enough to create a rift in the public's mind. Naomi was chosen for this assignment because she has what every investigation needs: weighty silence. She did not react hastily, did not need to make a fuss. Her task was to go like a normal person, just observe, take note, and if necessary, let justice speak for itself. 7:15 a.m. The loudspeaker system blared a steady female voice. Atlantic Star Flight AS-472 to Los Angeles is now boarding in approximately 30 minutes at Gate 42B. Naomi glanced at her watch. She was early, as always. Punctuality was more than habit. It was a form of respect both to herself and to her mission. She walked to the wait-in area and took a seat near the glass doors. The morning light streaming through the windows cast a cold sheen on her suit, giving it a metallic, disciplined feel. An older white couple sat nearby. The woman glanced at Naomi, squinted, then whispered something to her husband. The man just nodded, his gaze sweeping over her in a silent assessment. Is she really in first class? Naomi didn't respond. She looked out at the runway, where a Boeing 787 was taxiing slowly. In her mind, she made a cold note to herself, a look of appreciation, wordless but clear. She knew that moments like these, seemingly small, seemingly harmless, were where injustice began to take root. At gate 42B, Melissa Grant, the flight's lead boarding agent, was checking the scanner. She was in her 40s, with blonde hair tied back in a neat navy uniform. Everything about her was coldly precise except her eyes. As Naomi approached, the gaze lingered longer than necessary. Just a moment, but enough for Naomi to feel the air change. Not a welcome, but a suspicion wrapped in a service smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Are you on AS 472? "Yes." Naomi handed over the ticket, her voice even no higher than necessary. "Oh, first class, seat 3A. Melissa read slowly, as if verifying something. "May I see your ID?" Naomi took out her wallet and handed over her card. Meanwhile, a white man in a gray suit and a shiny watch walked up to scan the ticket. The machine beeped, and Melissa smiled in a different way. Bright, quick, no checking. "Have a great flight, sir." Naomi remained still. Melissa glanced back at the ID, then nodded slightly. "Okay, that makes sense. Please, come up." Naomi took the ticket back and walked slowly. No comment, but in her mind she marked recheck IDs only on black passengers. Behavior pattern is potentially biased. Little did she know, this was just the first touch of a tidal wave that was about to rise. The Atlantic Star's first-class cabin was dimly lit, and the scent of oak and genuine leather wafted through the air. Naomi placed her bag in the overhead compartment, sat down in seat 3A, buckled her seatbelt, and gently opened the display screen, all according to plan. She quickly texted Jordan Miles, her FTOA colleague in economy, who was there to keep an eye on the back crew. "Already up. The atmosphere in front of the gate is slightly suspicious." "Wait and see," Jordan replied with a then silence. Naomi breathed slowly. Everything was strangely peaceful. She opened her laptop, pretending to check her work email. But in fact, the recording software had already started, and the front camera was recording the entire cabin. Justice, sometimes, begins with the push of a button no one sees. Outside, through the glass. Melissa was still talking to someone on the walkie-talkie. She pointed toward first, a slight frown on her face. Naomi couldn't see, but she felt it. Her silence was not resignation, but a way of listening to how the world would denounce itself. The loudspeaker rang out, inviting the business group to board. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes half closed. People often mistake silence for weakness, but she knew that silence at the right time was the way to give the truth space to appear. She didn't know exactly what would happen on this flight, only one thing was certain. As long as prejudice exists, every flight carries a time bomb, and if it did, she would be the only one willing to listen to the sound with intelligence, not anger. But as soon as boarding first class came over the loudspeaker, Naomi realized that silence was about to end, because sometimes injustice doesn't need a loud voice, it just needs a smile to stop it at the right time. Naomi adjusted her collar and stood up from her chair. The morning light swept across the polished tile floor, reflecting her footsteps as she headed toward Gate 42B. Everything in the area seemed normal. The soft laughter, the rolling of suitcases, the faint smell of coffee from the nearby Starbucks, but to Naomi, the air carried an indescribable sense of anticipation. She felt as if she were entering a closed room where every eye was watching her every breath. Even though no one said anything, across the row, an older white couple sat close together. The woman in a cream cashmere coat, clutching a travel magazine, the man in silver-rimmed glasses, his eyes hidden behind the pages. But Naomi knew they weren't reading. They were just watching her through the gaps between the pages. A moment later, the woman leaned her head toward her husband and whispered, her voice low but loud enough for Naomi to hear a few words. "I don't think it's first class." "Huh?" The man snorted softly, then replied in a dry voice, "Maybe wrong flight." Naomi didn't look back. She just pursed her lips, as if making an invisible mental note. Judging by the eyes the beginning of all prejudice, she had seen this look many times in her career. In boardrooms, on trains, in hotel lobbies. Always someone trying to measure her worth by the color of her skin, the brand of her clothes, the style of her hair. Little did they know, she had nothing to prove. She just had to listen and wait for them to reveal themselves. Across the counter, Melissa Grant, the lead boarding attendant, was reorganizing the check-in counter. Her movements were quick and precise, but her eyes were constantly scanning the waiting area, as if she were reviewing a separate list in her head. Melissa was about 40, her blonde hair tied back, the light makeup on her face not hiding her hard features. When she saw Naomi, her gaze lingered longer than usual. Not the gaze of a professional waitress, but someone trying to figure out, does that woman really belong here? Naomi caught that gaze for a split second, enough to recognize the familiar sign of covert inspection. Okay, she thought to herself, this could be a starting point. A group of businessmen in suits lined up nearby, talking and laughing. They glanced at Naomi, then quickly turned back, lowering their voices. That feeling, the way people didn't have to say it outright, but still let you know you weren't welcome, permeated the air like the chill from an air conditioner. Naomi sat down on the bench against the wall, opened her phone, and pretended to check her email. In the Secret Notes app, she typed a few lines, Gate 42B, blonde female staff, eye contact twice in 5 minutes. Couple passengers showing judgmental attitude, level mild warning. She paused, raised her head, and let out a slow breath. She hadn't come here to be angry. She had come to witness, to let the facts write their own report. 10 minutes later, the loudspeaker announced first-class passengers. You may now begin boarding for Flight AS-472 to Los Angeles. Melissa Grant took the microphone, her voice even and slightly hoarse, the kind honed by thousands of flights, but lacking genuine warmth. Naomi stood up, ticket and ID in hand, and walked to the counter. She smiled slightly, like every other passenger. "Good morning." "Yes, good morning," Melissa replied, but her voice trailed off as she looked down at the ticket. "Are you flying first class?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Yes." "Seat 3A." Melissa was silent for a second, then nodded, but the smile was gone. "Can I see your ID again?" Naomi handed over her ID, remaining calm. Meanwhile, a white man in a navy suit walked up behind her, scanned her ticket, and was greeted by Melissa with a friendly smile, without further inspection. She heard Melissa say, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Campbell. Enjoy your flight," then turned back to Naomi, his voice drier and colder. "Thank you. Could you please step aside for a moment while I check the system?" Naomi did as she was told. She said nothing, just watched. In her mind, each action was filed in its own column, comparing passengers in the same zone. Different treatment, yes. A younger white woman in a trench coat pulled up with a suitcase. Melissa scanned her ticket, didn't ask for ID, didn't ask to stop. Have a great flight came out of nowhere. Naomi, who was holding a valid first-class ticket, remained standing, watching Melissa type something on the screen. Right, the reservation is valid, Melissa said finally, her voice absent-minded. You can go. Naomi nodded her thanks, then stepped through the scanner. No one in line noticed, but to her, a small line had been crossed, not because she was a few seconds behind, but because Melissa looked at her like she needed to prove her right to be there, stepping into the airstrip. Naomi lightly touched the cool metal wall. She felt things were starting to go the way the investigation had hoped. A strange look, she thought, usually a sign of something going wrong. Behind her, Naomi heard Melissa laughing with someone, the sound as dry as the metal of the elevator. She walked on, slowly. Each step echoed softly on the aluminum floor, like a countdown to a confrontation that would not be in words, but in actions. Small actions, enough to expose a large prejudice. When Naomi entered the cabin, the flight attendant greeted her with a polite smile. But she couldn't shake the chill that ran down her spine, as if she had just crossed a threshold that someone deemed her not worthy to pass through. She sat down in chair 3A, gently opened the notebook, and wrote a few lines. Eyes, voice, attitude are clearly different when passengers are people of color. Melissa Grant, gate 42B, needs further monitoring. She put down her pen, closed her notebook, and stared out the window. The plane was refueling. Ground crews were moving about, everyone busy. Everything looked normal, but Naomi knew that sometimes injustice looked normal too. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. Somewhere in the belly of this plane, justice was waiting to be awakened, if only someone would dare to observe long enough, patient enough to react not with anger, but with wisdom. Naomi thought she could wait until the plane closed its doors, but 5 minutes after she buckled into seat 3A, the click of Melissa's shoes echoed down the aisle, and with it, the smell of a storm entering first class. Melissa Grant stopped looking around and stopped smiling. She walked straight toward Naomi, the list in her hand shaking slightly as she walked. Her heels clicked against the floor like the beat of an approaching domination. Naomi looked up, her eyes as calm as water. In that moment, no one at first realized that the calm before the storm often contains something greater than any argument. "Excuse me," Miss Carter Melissa asked, her voice trying to be polite but lacking the softness of someone serving a customer. "Yes," Naomi replied. Melissa glanced at the ticket, then looked Naomi up and down, her gaze cold as metal. "I need to check your ID. There's a bit of a problem with the system." Naomi said nothing, just took out her wallet, handed back her ID as if holding up a mirror for the other person to look at themselves. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice low, not harsh, but with a silence that made others wary. Melissa smiled wryly. "Nothing serious. It's probably just a duplicate booking number." Naomi knew full well airlines never override reservations with first-class tickets. But she remained silent. While Melissa bent her head and typed on the handheld scanner, Naomi watched. Behind her, a white man, about 50, in a gray suit and shiny leather shoes, approached the counter. Melissa looked up, and, as if programmed, a service smile appeared. "Hello, Mr. Campbell. Enjoy your flight." He scanned his ticket, beeped, and walked straight into the compartment without further questions. Naomi glanced over, not out of jealousy, but because she wanted to remember this moment of disparity in every detail. Just then, a young white woman carrying a Hermes bag walked up. Melissa didn't stop. A simple, "Welcome aboard, ma'am," was enough to get her through the door. And Naomi, still standing there, like a shadow held back by the process reserved only for those who don't look like other people's image of first class. Melissa typed a few more keys, then raised her head, her forced smile returning. "Okay, that makes sense. Please come up." Naomi took the ID back, her eyes unchanged, her voice small but resolute. "I guess your system just corrected itself." The words were as light as a breeze, but they made Melissa pause for half a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Naomi to see a flash of guilt in the other woman's eyes. She walked through the gate without looking back. Needless to say, at FTOA, they call it a moment of bias. That first, small, but enough moment of bias to shake a system. As Naomi walked through the aisle leading to the cabin, she heard the loudspeaker gate 42B, now boarding Group 2. A new line of people followed, carrying with them a buzz of chatter. Naomi quietly put her headphones back on, turned on the voice recording mode on her phone, and sat down in seat 3A. She looked around the first-class cabin. There were only 8 seats, each like a small compartment. The passengers were mostly white, neatly dressed. No one paid her any attention, or, if they did, they only glanced at her as if wondering who she was. She didn't blame him. Prejudice didn't always come from malice. Sometimes it was just a legacy of things that had never been fixed. Naomi opened the thin leather notebook and wrote a few lines. Gate 42B, selective ID check. At the same time, white passengers are allowed through without verification. Distinguishing mark medium. She closed the book, put it in her pocket, and leaned her head back. The loudspeaker blared again, announcing boarding closure in 10 minutes. She relaxed her shoulders and looked out the window. The New York sky was hazy, like a layer of smog, and in that haze, Naomi saw her own reflection, a quiet black woman, but ready to make an entire airline rethink how they treated people like her. She texted Jordan Miles. Her colleague sitting in economy passed the gate. There are signs of selection and inspection. Take note. A thumbs up appeared. Nothing more. They understood each other. In this business, silence was the only way to maintain objectivity. Naomi closed her eyes. Everything seemed peaceful, but she knew this peace was only a thin mask covering something larger waiting to emerge. This flight is not just a journey from New York to Los Angeles. It is a journey from prejudice to justice, and sometimes that distance is longer than any route on the map. Melissa returned to the counter, her eyes still glancing toward the first-class cabin through the small window. She said something to the attendant next to her, her voice low. Naomi couldn't hear it, but she sensed something was being prepared. A mistake about to happen again, not by accident, but by habit. Naomi put her hands on the armrest, feeling her heartbeat steady. She wasn't angry. She never got angry in situations like this, because she knew that if she let anger take over, justice would lose its weight. She smiled faintly and said softly to herself, "Let's see what else they want to try." Little did she know that, in just a few minutes, they would actually try, and that mistake would become living proof of an entire investigation. But then, 5 minutes after the plane door closed, Melissa's footsteps echoed again. This time, she wasn't alone. A young flight attendant was standing next to her, and when Melissa stopped right in front of seat 3A, Naomi knew the real test had begun. Naomi raised her head and looked at the two women approaching. The pale, yellow light from the ceiling lights reflected off their faces, making every feature tense and stark to the point of being naked. She didn't need to hear to know that this wasn't some additional service. Miss Carter Melissa asked, her voice even, but no longer polite. Yes, Naomi replied, her voice soft, cold, and steady, as if she had expected this. Melissa glanced at the flight attendant standing next to her, a young woman in her 20s, brown hair, a confused look on her face. Then Melissa held the list in her hand, emphasizing each word. There is a change in seating. Your seat, 3A, is double booked. We need you to move down to economy. A silence fell. In the first cabin, 4 nearby passengers began to look up slightly. They didn't intervene, but their eyes were enough to show that they were judging who was right and who was wrong. Naomi slowly unbuckled her seatbelt and sat up straight. Double book, she repeated, as if checking to see if she had heard correctly. I checked in online. My boarding pass listed seat 3A. I was scanned at the gate. Can you explain the process? Melissa did not answer immediately. She shifted her posture, her voice slightly harsh. We don't need to explain the process. Just know that this is a decision made by the boarding department. If you don't want to move to the back seat, you can choose another flight. The young flight attendant beside her glanced at Naomi, her eyes slightly apologetic, but she said nothing. Naomi looked straight at Melissa. Her eyes weren't raised, weren't threatening, just cold and still. So, I, who boarded the plane properly, am being asked to leave my seat because of a system error that you can't prove. Melissa frowned slightly, her voice becoming dry as sand. I was just following orders, ma'am. There was another premium passenger with priority. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze sweeping across the front cabin, and she saw him, a white man, about 50, in a black suit, with a shiny watch, stood right in front of the cabin. He held his ticket, looked around, and when his eyes landed on seat 3A, where Naomi was sitting, he smiled faintly. Not a polite smile, but the smile of someone who had just seen something return to order. Naomi understood immediately this was no longer a technical error. This was a deliberate choice. I want to see the confirmation from the system, Naomi said, her voice so calm that it made the surrounding air seem to slow down. And I want to see the chief flight attendant. Melissa crossed her arms, exhaled, and tried to stay patient. You can file a complaint after the flight. We need to process it quickly as the plane is about to take off. I have the authority to request a change of seat. The very word authority rings like a petty assertion. Naomi took a deep breath. She didn't get angry. She never got angry in situations like this. She just watched, took it in, and let things play out the way real justice should, with evidence, with action, with witnesses. She nodded slightly. If that is your decision, I will follow it. But I want to know both of your names. Melissa paused. Melissa Grant, boarding attendant. And you. Naomi looked at the young flight attendant, Sophia Perez. The girl replied softly, looking embarrassed. Naomi smiled slightly. Thank you, Ms. Perez. She stood up. No argument, no quarrel. Just quietly opened the trunk and pulled down her bag. Every eye in the first-class cabin watched. Some looked down, some stared. No one said anything, because the silence was more comfortable than facing the fact that they were witnessing a person being degraded simply because of the color of their skin. As Naomi passed the white man, he smiled and nodded slightly as if to say, Thank you for understanding my position." Naomi didn't reply. She just looked straight ahead, walking past without making a second eye contact. Outside the first cabin, the cabin door clicked shut behind him like a lock sealing a living testament. Flight attendant Sophia led Naomi through the narrow aisle to the middle row of economy class, seat 25B. The space here was more cramped. The voices were louder. The smell of food mixed with the smell of air conditioning. "I'm so sorry, miss," Sophia whispered as Naomi sat down. "I was only following Grant's orders." "I know," Naomi replied, her voice almost a whisper. "And you did your job." Sophia looked at Naomi for a second, as if wanting to say something more, but then fell silent and turned away. Naomi opened her phone and typed a few lines in the Notes app, 10:27 a.m., asked to leave seat 3A for double book, replacement passenger Caucasian male, Rolex watch, no systemic evidence, employees involved Melissa Grant, gate 42B, Sophia Perez, cabin crew. She lingered. Her hands did not shake. She felt no shame, only a deep, old sadness, like a song that had been played too many times in history, except this time she was recording it. An elderly black woman sitting in the front row turned around and said softly, "They took you down." Naomi smiled slightly. Yes, it seemed so. The woman shook her head, sighing slightly. "This keeps happening, doesn't it?" Naomi just replied softly, "It's okay. This time, it will be recorded." She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The engines began to hum beneath the fuselage, and as Atlantic Star AS-472 slowly rolled off the runway, Naomi knew she had just passed the most important moment of the mission, the moment of prejudice being displayed publicly, right in front of everyone. No need to argue, no need to yell, just be calm enough to let the truth reveal itself. When the all-clear signal went off, Naomi opened her eyes. She had no intention of revealing herself, not yet, but she knew that, for justice to be served, sometimes it was necessary to take a step back, and when she took a step back, they would take a step further into their own error. The plane had barely been off the ground for 10 minutes when Naomi could already feel the difference in the atmosphere. The first cabin at the front was quiet, while in the economy cabin, where she was being pushed down, the sounds of conversation mixed with the clanking of plastic trays, but Naomi couldn't hear anything clearly. Her mind was still stuck on the moment she was pulled from seat 3A. She looked into the space between the two rows of seats, the light reflecting off the small folding screen in front of her. In that reflection, she saw her own face calm, but inside was a silent wave. A man sitting next to him asked softly, "They switched you?" Naomi nodded. "Yes, it seems so." "That's absurd," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen people do it to people before, but never so blatantly." Naomi smiled slightly. Maybe they thought I wouldn't ask. And indeed, she would ask, but not with anger, but with the wisdom of someone who knew the law better than anyone in this cabin. She pressed the call button. Less than a minute later, the young flight attendant, Sophia Perez, returned. Her eyes were still filled with guilt. "Miss Carter, can I help you?" Naomi kept her voice loud, but each word was clear and distinct as if she were reciting the law in her head. "I want to see proof of the seat change. Paperwork or system information is fine." Sophia bit her lip, embarrassed. "I don't have access to that part. Only the gate side controls it." Naomi nodded slightly. "So is there any announcement of changing planes or changing seat configurations?" Sophia shook her head. "Honestly, no, ma'am. All seats are the same as they were this morning." Naomi was silent for a few seconds, then spoke slowly. "Good. Then I request to see the chief flight attendant or the captain, just to confirm the procedure." Sophia was startled for a moment, perhaps because no passenger in the economy class had ever said the words "verify" process so calmly. I will report back," she whispered and left, her expression both fearful and respectful. Naomi watched, her eyes not angry, only expectant. Inside, she was testing the system. In FTOA, they call this a reaction probe. No provocation, just observing what the company chooses, process, or prejudice. 10 minutes passed. No one came. Naomi opened her notebook and wrote 10:47 a.m., requested to verify seat change. No response. Flight attendant did not call supervisor. She remained calm, her eyes fixed on the curtain separating the two compartments. A moment later, Sophia returned, accompanied by Melissa Grant. Melissa no longer smiled this time, only carrying a tone as hard as steel. "Miss Carter, I've made it clear, if you want to complain, you can do so after landing. The plane is in flight now. I cannot interfere further." Naomi looked at her. There was a moment of silence. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, as if speaking only to Melissa. "I'm not asking for special privileges. I'm just asking for due process." Melissa smiled slightly, the smile carrying a slight irony. "You think you understand the process better than me." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her eyes softening, a kind of softness that made people feel uncomfortable. "I do know one thing," she said slowly, "that once a passenger has boarded properly, it is against federal operating policy to remove them from first to make way for someone else without confirmation from the supervisor." Melissa paused for half a second. She looked at Naomi, then glanced around the cabin. A few nearby passengers were looking their way, trying to pretend not to hear but clearly curious. "Can you stop this?" Melissa lowered her voice, annoyed. "I'm trying to help you." Naomi frowned, her voice dropping even lower, but colder. "If helping means keeping silent about wrongdoing, then maybe I don't need help." That statement made Sophia standing beside her feel uneasy. She looked at Naomi, the eyes of a young person realizing for the first time that politeness is sometimes not enough to cover up injustice. Melissa tried to hold back, breathing heavily. "I have to close the cabin door. Please sit down." Naomi nodded, not arguing. She sat back in row 25, buckled her seat belt, but in her mind, every detail was being layered into evidence, cold, precise, undeniable. In the first cabin, some passengers were still whispering. A man asked his wife, "You see, she doesn't look like she's done anything wrong." The woman replied softly, "But there must be a reason. They wouldn't be so stupid as to change their first-class seats." Naomi couldn't hear it clearly, but she knew that kind of conversation. She'd heard it all her life. People who weren't bad, just afraid of inconvenience. They chose to stay silent because they believed everyone has their reasons. But silence, when standing on the side of the strong, is also a form of choice. Naomi flipped open her phone and turned on the second recording mode. She said nothing, just letting the microphone pick up the sounds, the conversation, the waiters, and the gaps between words where prejudice often lurks. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and listened to the sound of the engine. Each time it revved, she felt a pulse of justice awakening. Her goal was never to win an argument. She was here to see which side they took, the right side or the familiar side. And Melissa, with every word, every contemptuous look was helping her to write down the answer. Moments later, Jordan Miles, Naomi's co-worker, sent a text message. "What's wrong?" Naomi replied curtly. "Procedure skipped. Monitoring." She hung up the phone, her eyes staring out at the curtain that separated First. She didn't need to see. She just needed to wait, because in every system that fails, the next mistake always finds itself. The flight had been underway for almost an hour. When the service lights went out, Naomi quietly opened her phone and began writing down her mission log. Little did she know, in a few minutes, her decision to temporarily accept would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Naomi sat up straight and pulled her phone from her jacket pocket. The screen reflected a pale blue light onto her face, still expressionless, but her eyes focused as if reading an invisible verdict. She opened the Notes app and started typing. 10:53 a.m., Flight AS-472 Atlantic Star Airlines, Gate Agent Melissa Grant, Cabin Attendant Sophia Perez. Reason for seat change, double book, no evidence. Replacement passenger Caucasian male, Rolex, approximately 50 years old. I was moved to row 25, middle seat. She paused, looking around. Everything in economy seemed foreign to the serenity of first class. There was no scent of perfume, no folded blankets on the seats, no smiling attendants. There were only familiar sounds, crying babies, the clanking of suitcases, and the sighs of people accustomed to being put in the back of the line. Naomi placed her phone on her lap, turned on the camera, and tilted it slightly to record the seat number board. Not to denounce, but to record. She always believed that the truth did not need to be shouted, just kept at the right time. A flight attendant pushed a cart past. Naomi watched, her eyes accidentally stopping at the row in front, where an elderly black woman with curly salt and pepper hair was calling softly, "Excuse me, miss, can I have a blanket?" The flight attendant didn't stop right away. She was smiling at a white passenger sitting by the window, who had just been given a glass of white wine by a quiet request. The old woman called again. "Miss, I'm a little cold." The flight attendant replied without turning her head, "I'll be back later, ma'am." 5 minutes passed. She did not return. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her hand already taking notes. Black female passenger in row 24C, requested blanket 3 times and was not met. White passenger next to her, 24A, was served alcohol immediately. Obvious bias. She looked at the woman. Her eyes weren't angry, just tired. The kind of tiredness that comes from learning to tolerate little things so much that they become normal. Naomi knew that feeling. She had seen it in the mirror, years ago. She leaned her head back slightly, trying to find a comfortable position in the small space. A passenger sitting next to her, a middle-aged white man with a potbelly reading a sports magazine, glanced at her phone screen and saw the notes. "Are you a journalist?" Naomi smiled and closed the phone. "Not really. I just remember things I shouldn't forget." He smiled wryly, then turned away. The light from the overhead lights turned a warm hue. She felt her heartbeat slow. The silence began to return, but it was no longer peace. It was the calm before the storm. At the front of the compartment, Sophia passed by and caught a glimpse of Naomi. They exchanged a brief glance. The young woman looked as if she wanted to say something, but then turned away and continued her work. Naomi didn't blame her. She understood, sometimes, the fear of losing her job was stronger than the fear of making a mistake. She opened the notebook, the page with the folded corner. the part used for taking notes directly on the mission. The ballpoint pen moved slowly across the paper. Initial observations. Service system shows implicit discrimination. Staff response to black passengers requesting assistance is significantly slower. Melissa Grant shows bias from the boarding stage. Sophia Perez, no intentional discrimination, but follows wrong orders. She paused, looking down at the words. Each word was like a small piece of a larger picture slowly coming into view. Naomi knew there was nothing more she needed to do now. Just wait. Prejudice, left unchecked, would reveal itself. At that moment, the intercom rang. A gentle female voice announcing that lunch was about to be served. Naomi looked up and saw the elderly woman raising her hand for the third time. "Sorry, miss, I don't have a blanket yet." This time, another flight attendant passed by, looking at her with a polite smile. "We're out of blankets, ma'am." But at the same time, another white passenger, 2 rows ahead, asked for and promptly received a folded blanket. The old woman looked down and said softly to herself, "I guess they saved the blanket for someone warmer than me." Naomi heard the words clearly. There was no bitterness, only a gentle sadness that made her heart clench. She wrote in her notebook, "Service attitude, systematic bias. Not an isolated incident." She put away her notebook and leaned her head back against the chair. If anyone were to look at her now, they would see a normal, quiet, untroubled woman. But inside, every detail was being put together like a puzzle piece in an investigation file. She's collecting not only evidence, but also a portrait of a system that has become accustomed to disregarding fairness. About an hour later, Naomi looked out the window. The sun was high in the sky, its light filtering through the clouds like a thin veil. She remembered the words of her old mentor at FTOA. If you want to see what a prejudice is, don't create it, let it run its course, and then listen to its collapse. She smiled slightly. She didn't need to fight with words. She just needed to be patient enough to let the truth find her. From the front of the cabin, a low rumble of argument could be heard. It seemed to be between 2 flight attendants. Naomi couldn't hear it clearly, but in the muffled noise, she caught the name Melissa Grant. She opened her phone and turned on recording. The wave was rising, and Naomi knew she just had to keep still, like a mirror in the middle of the cabin, and let everything wrong reflect itself. The loudspeaker announced, "Fasten seatbelt," but before Naomi could fasten her seatbelt, a man in pilot's uniform walked down the aisle. Everyone looked up, and when he stopped in front of her, Naomi knew the system was responding. The atmosphere in the economy cabin changed. There was no longer chatter mixed with the sound of the engines, but a curious, tense silence. A tall, square-shouldered, composed man in his 50s, Captain Daniel Brooks, approached, followed by a neat, gray-haired chief stewardess, Linda Rowe. Naomi looked up. Their eyes met, not the eyes of enemies, but of 2 people who understood that something in the system had gone wrong. Captain Brooks inclined his head, his voice low and measured. "Is this Miss Carter?" "Yes," Naomi replied calmly. "I'm Daniel Brooks, the captain of this flight. I'd like to have a word with you, if you don't mind." The entire economy cabin seemed to stop for a few seconds. Naomi unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Curious, sympathetic, and even a few puzzled looks surrounded her, like people watching a mystery unfold. The galley in front of the plane, where the only light was dim and the clatter of the hot water heater, was strangely quiet. Linda Rowe stood guard beside it, her blue-gray eyes filled with the worry of someone who had flown thousands of flights. but knew this one was unlike any other. Captain Brooks motioned for Naomi to sit on the small stool next to the exit. Then he stood opposite. "I was informed," he said slowly, "that you were asked to leave your first-class seat. Is that correct?" Naomi nodded. Yes, the reason given was double book. Linda Rowe sighed softly, glancing down at the electronic board in her hand. "I checked the system log. Seat 3A can only be booked once. There's no double book, and in fact, once you have boarded properly, the ground staff are not allowed to change seats." Naomi looked at them, not speaking, just listening. Miss Grant, the gate agent, should have handled this from the ground. Captain Brooks continued, his voice full of restraint, but instead she pulled the passengers off. "I sincerely apologize. This was a serious error of procedure." He paused, his eyes softening. "Currently, seat 5C in first class is empty. If you want, I will personally arrange for you to return there." Naomi was silent for a moment. She could see the sincerity in his words, but justice did not stop with an apology. "Thank you, Captain Brooks," she replied softly. "I will return to my seat, but we will talk after the flight, in a different setting. There. I hope your airline will not simply apologize." Linda Rowe paused. The way Naomi spoke, standard, calm, but with a layer of meaning they both sensed this woman was no ordinary passenger. Captain Brooks nodded slightly. "I understand, and I will make sure you're treated properly for the rest of the flight." Naomi smiled, a fleeting smile that left no trace. The rule, if someone had remembered it sooner, I wouldn't have sat in row 25. When Naomi returned to first, all eyes were on her again. The white man, wearing a luxury watch sitting in seat 3A, her seat, looked up slightly, seemingly unhappy to see the captain with him. Linda Rowe said softly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Sorry for the mistake, but this passenger is supposed to be in seat 3A. We will ask you to move to another seat. There is seat 2F available." The man paused, his lips pressed together. He looked at Naomi with a mixture of surprise and discontent, but then stood up, reluctantly. Naomi just bowed her head slightly, saying nothing. There was no sign of gloating nor forgiveness, just someone taking back her place, exactly as she deserved to have had it all along. She sat down in 3A and pulled up her seatbelt. Linda Rowe gently placed a glass of water in front of her and whispered, "I'm so sorry. Ma'am, we shouldn't have let this happen." Naomi replied softly, "It's okay. Miss Rowe, sometimes one needs to be wrong once to remember what is fair." Captain Brooks left the cabin, but he returned once more, speaking softly enough for only Naomi to hear. "If you need anything, I'll be in the cockpit." Naomi just nodded, and there was something in his eyes, respect, and also shame for those who had done wrong before. As the plane stabilized, the atmosphere in first cabin returned to normal. There was the sound of spoons clinking against glasses, the flipping of magazines, and even breathing. But Naomi knew that behind the silence, there were still waves that had not yet calmed. She tilted her head, looking out the window. The ocean below was like a giant mirror reflecting the sky. Everything in her eyes condensed into a single thought. Justice is not something people bring with words, but with actions, sometimes from people within the system. And today, Captain Brooks' actions, however small, are the beginning of the change she's watching. At the back of the cabin, Sophia Perez, the young flight attendant, quietly looked up from afar. When she saw Naomi being invited back to her first-class seat, she gave a small smile, not because of relief, but because something rare began to appear in her heart: awareness. She understood that by staying silent about something wrong, she was becoming a part of it. Naomi opened her phone and wrote a few more lines. 11:36 a.m., Captain Daniel Brooks and Lead F.A. Linda Rowe intervene. Formal apology. Seats restored. Reaction from surrounding passengers observing. Quiet. Violation level serious, but with opportunity for improvement. Positive attitude of Captain and Chief F.A. noted. She lingered. The light from the screen reflected off the glass, illuminating her eyes no longer cold, but warmer, as if she had just seen a small crack of light shining through the thick wall of prejudice. As Naomi took her first sip of water since boarding the plane, she heard a small argument between two flight attendants behind the curtain. A familiar voice, Sophia, and an older voice, Linda Rowe. The next pieces of the truth were about to reveal themselves. If only she could sit still and listen. The sounds started out as just a few whispers, as if two people were trying to maintain civility on a quiet flight. But gradually, Sophia Perez's voice became higher, filled with tension and confusion. "You called Melissa Grant onto the plane." There was a brief silence. Then Linda Rowe's voice replied, low, tired, but still in control. "I just followed orders from the gate. They said there was a problem with the 3A ticket. I couldn't skip the process." Naomi put down her glass. She didn't try to listen, just let her mind open, as if the words behind the curtain were finding their way to her. Sophia spoke again, her voice trembling with either anger or fear. "But you know the ticket is valid. I checked it." She checked in properly. Her boarding pass was scanned. "I told you, but you still told me to call Melissa." A sigh came, long, heavy. "You don't understand. Sophia. When Melissa Grant asked for a recheck, I had no right to refuse. They had the right to report fraud, and I had to support them." Sophia burst out. "But what if she sues? The whole flight could be involved. Who do you think the airline will protect? Melissa or us?" There was a slight clang of a metal tray. Then silence. Naomi didn't turn around, just stared straight at the thick curtains that were swaying gently in the air. Their words were enough for her to understand this wasn't an individual mistake, but a series of missteps in a system accustomed to suspiciousness towards those who don't look like first-class passengers. She opened her phone and texted Jordan Miles, her colleague sitting in the back seat. Overheard the conversation between F.A. It seems Melissa Grant initiated the call to Linda for support. They were blaming each other. Less than a minute later, Jordan responded, "I see. The back is no better. White passengers get priority service. Black people have to be called twice. There is obvious bias. I'm taking notes on the time log." Naomi closed her eyes. Everything was coming together. Pieces of the big picture that FTOA had long suspected a culture of judging by appearances. As Linda stepped out from behind the curtain, Naomi glanced up. Their eyes met briefly. Linda bowed her head slightly, a silent apology, but also an avoidance. Sophia followed, her face still red, her hands clasped together. She glanced at Naomi and then quickly looked away, afraid that just one look would reveal something she shouldn't. Naomi remained calm. She did not need to interfere. Justice did not need someone to shout to be heard. It only needed someone patient enough to see when the wall began to crack. She opened the Notes app and added a new line. The dialogue between the head FA and the young flight attendant confirmed the action from the gate was intentional, not a mistake. There was an element of complicity from the cabin. The level of internal awareness was noted divided. She saved it, then put the phone down on the table. A passenger sitting next to him, a man in a suit with salt and pepper hair, tilted his head and asked softly, "Sorry, I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but what were they arguing about just now?" Naomi turned around. Her smile softened, but her eyes could not hide the coldness of someone who had witnessed too many such scenes, about how justice sometimes goes astray, and then finds itself again. She said slowly, almost metaphorically. The man frowned, thought, then fell silent. The cabin lights dimmed. The plane was at a steady altitude, the sky outside a deep, endless blue. Naomi looked out the small window and saw her reflection in the glass, calm, not angry, but her eyes already filled with fragments of truth. In her head, Sophia and Linda's conversation still resounded in fragments. "You called Melissa onto the plane. I was just following orders. If she sues, it will be a big deal. Each sentence is a link in the chain. None of them are evil, but it is the fear of confrontation that turns them into defenders of injustice." Naomi opened her phone again. This time she texted Jordan another message. "I think we're seeing what the internal report calls a bias chain. From gate to cabin, no one is actively causing harm, but everyone is contributing to it." Jordan replied after a few seconds, "That chain will collapse. If only someone would tell the truth." Naomi looked at the message, then smiled. A slight smile, like someone who had just confirmed what she had always believed. If just one person in the system dared to speak, the entire flawed mechanism would begin to shake. She leaned back, closing her eyes slightly, but inside, her mind was still working, not judging, just registering. Every footstep of the flight attendant, every voice of the passenger, every casual glance, all were becoming part of the invisible file she carried with her. No one knew that the woman sitting in seat 3A, quiet and calm, was the one who could make the entire airline face their own conscience. At the back of the compartment, Sophia leaned against the wall, peeking through the curtains. She saw Naomi sitting calmly, staring out the window, as if nothing had happened, and it was that silence that bothered Sophia. She whispered to Linda, "I don't think she's like a normal person." Linda turned back, her eyes tired. "We just need to finish this flight. Don't think about it anymore." Sophia nodded, but in her heart she knew. There were things, no matter how hard she tried to forget, that would find a way to come back, especially when justice was on the same plane. Naomi had just finished writing the last line when the emergency bell rang from the front of the cabin. A female passenger suddenly had difficulty breathing. Little did anyone know. This medical incident would inadvertently expose another layer of bias that Naomi was investigating. The ding sound rang out repeatedly, breaking the silence in the first-class cabin. The sound of the seats moving, and someone's hurried voice rang out. "She can't breathe. Someone help." Naomi turned her head reflexively. In row 1C, a white woman in her 40s, her face pale, hugged her neck with one hand and held her husband's hand with the other. The man beside her pressed the emergency bell again, his voice cracking with panic. "She's having an allergic reaction. Please, someone." For a moment, all eyes were on them, but there was only silence. 3 seconds, 5 seconds. 10 seconds passed. No flight attendant appeared. Only then did the husband shout, "We need an EpiPen." She's about to pass out. The curtain opened, and Sophia Perez and Linda Rowe rushed in. "What happened?" Linda asked, her voice panicked but trying to stay calm. "Nut allergy. She ate a cookie with nuts in it. Where's the EpiPen?" The husband almost screamed. Sophia fumbled with the first aid kit, but her hands were shaking. She couldn't find the equipment right away. Linda bent down to check on the passenger. While the woman began to convulse slightly, Naomi stood up, ignoring all manners. She walked quickly to the front row, her voice firm. "I have an EpiPen." She pulled out a personal medical syringe from the small bag in her coat, something she always carried on all business trips, according to FTOA regulations. Linda looked up, surprised, then nodded immediately. Naomi knelt down and gently injected the woman into her arm. After a few seconds, her breathing began again, weak but steady. Her husband, trembling, took Naomi's hand and choked. "Thank you. Oh my God, thank you." Naomi just nodded, saying nothing. She looked around. The other passengers were watching, worried, and Sophia was still searching the first aid kit for her EpiPen. "Found it?" Linda asked, her voice a little tense. I didn't see it in its usual place." Sophia stammered. Linda turned to Naomi, trying to regain her professionalism. "Thank you for your help. Miss Carter, she'll be fine. We'll notify the captain." Naomi stood up, her voice calm to the point of cold. "I think you should have reported more than that. Both the loss of the EpiPen and first, and the fact that it took you more than 10 seconds to respond to the emergency signal." Linda turned pale. The husband was still reassuring his wife, but turned back and spoke loudly, his voice full of indignation. "We rang the bell 3 times. No one came. If it weren't for her, my wife would have." He stopped, his voice choked. The cabin fell silent. Naomi watched the scene silently, not speaking, not intervening. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. 10 minutes later, when the situation had stabilized, Linda returned to Naomi. Her voice was small, but still maintained a managerial attitude. "The captain knows what happened. Thank you for your quick action. This is a medical incident, unrelated to the previous incident." Naomi looked up, her eyes meeting Linda's, deep and calm as water. "I know, but the way the crew reacted, it said more than you think." Linda frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Naomi lowered her voice. She reacted slowly because she didn't trust the signal coming from someone important. Just like how her airline judges passengers, by looks, not by responsibility. Linda didn't answer. Only the sound of the engine outside filled the silence. Naomi didn't blame her, but every word she spoke seemed to leave a mark. "I understand." Naomi continued. "Everyone has habits, but in aviation, bad habits can kill." Linda looked at her, and in her eyes, for the first time, there was what Naomi had hoped to see, genuine shame. Sophia returned, carrying the EpiPen she found in the last compartment of the medical bay. She placed it on the table, looked at Naomi, and said in a small but sincere voice, "I'm sorry. I should have checked before flying." Naomi just nodded slightly. "It's okay. The important thing is that now you know." Sophia looked at Naomi for a moment, then left. Linda stood still, not saying anything more, just sighed. Naomi returned to her chair, grabbed her phone, and took notes. 12:04 p.m. Medical incident: female passenger had nut allergy. EpiPen not available. Cabin response was slow more than 10 seconds. Husband had to call for help multiple times. Another passenger, Naomi Carter, provided EpiPen and assisted with injection. Additional violations noted slow response procedure, missing medical equipment check. She lingered, then sat still. No anger, no complacency, just a distant gaze out the window where the sunlight was shining on the wings of the plane. Inside the cabin, the air was still, but this time the silence was different, not out of politeness, but because everyone was thinking about what had just happened, how someone's life could be in danger just because someone didn't believe the signal was serious. Naomi closed her eyes and took a deep breath. In that moment, she realized discrimination sometimes lies not in the words, but in the delay in response, who hears first, and who has to repeat himself a third time. She added a short line as a conclusion to the temporary note, "Not all mistakes are due to malice. Some are simply due to indifference, but the consequences of indifference are as cruel as discrimination." As the plane steadied, Sophia approached Naomi, gently motioning for a private conversation. Her voice was small and trembling, as if she were carrying a secret Carter. "I have something to tell you about Melissa Grant." Naomi looked up, her gaze still calm. She looked at Sophia, narrow shoulders, her uniform still wrinkled with tension, her hands clasped together. "Can we talk somewhere quieter?" Naomi asked, her voice devoid of pressure, only the certainty of someone who had heard more confessions than excuses. Sophia nodded. She led Naomi to the back of the cabin, into the galley area, where the smell of coffee, metal, and engine noise mixed together like a soundtrack of secrets no one wanted to tell. The small door closed. In the dim yellow light, Sophia stood still for a moment, then said softly, "I think you have the right to know this." Naomi said nothing, just waited, before boarding started. When Melissa Grant saw your name on the first-class list, she told us, verbatim, that she's on the marked list. Maybe the ticket is fake or booked incorrectly. The sentence fell into the void, heavy as a stone hitting water. Naomi kept her expression neutral, only tilting her head slightly. "And you believe that Sophia bowed her head?" I didn't think much of it. Melissa was the gatekeeper, so I just followed orders. She also said that the airline had encountered cases of black people faking first-class tickets to climb up to get ahead. I thought it was a security issue, so I followed orders. Naomi looked down at the floor, gently turning the plastic cup in her hand. "And when you check again," Sophia sighed, her eyes welling up. "Perfectly legal, no warnings, no list." There was a long silence. The engine hummed like a steady heartbeat, and Sophia was trembling. "I know I was wrong. I saw it all from the beginning. Melissa's eyes, the way she looked at you, the way she said, 'She's not getting a free ride in first class on my watch.' I don't know why I didn't say anything. I thought maybe it was just a small matter." Naomi looked up. "A small thing," she repeated, her voice so soft that Sophia had to look up. But it was enough to get a man pulled from his chair just because of the color of his skin. Sophia did not reply. Her tears welled up, quick and silent. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice cracking. "I was just afraid Melissa would write it up. At Liberty Airport. Everyone knew she was mean to black passengers, but no one dared to say anything. If I argued back, I could have been transferred or even lost my position." Naomi placed her hand on Sophia's shoulder. The light touch almost made the girl cry. "Sophia, you're not the first person in the system to be afraid to say what is right, but the difference is you still have a chance to fix it." Sophia looked at Naomi, confused. How? Do you fix it? Work with FTOA, Naomi said slowly, clearly. That's the agency I work for. We're not looking to punish people, but to hear the truth. If you're afraid of being disciplined, FTOA can protect you as a witness. Sophia's eyes widened. You are from FTOA. Naomi nodded slightly. That's right. I didn't say it earlier because I wanted to see things clearly. Now I see. Sophia took a step back, almost stunned. She raised her hand to her mouth, then let out a small laugh, half relief, half surprise. So, you just pulled out a federal inspector's chair. It's okay, Naomi said, her smile small but meaningful. That chair isn't as important as what you're about to say. They stood in silence for a few seconds. Naomi let Sophia regain her composure, then asked, What else did Melissa say about me? Sophia nodded. She told the gate crew, If she causes trouble, call me immediately. Then she made a note in the system, flag for ID verification. No one checked, so it automatically spread to the suspect passenger list. Naomi took note. It was technical evidence, key to the investigation later. Are you willing to put this in writing if we request it? Naomi asked. Sophia was silent for a moment, then took a deep breath. If FTOA can protect me, then yes, I will tell everything. Naomi smiled. Okay, you just did the hardest thing a person in the system can do, choose the truth. As they stepped out of the galley, the cabin lights dimmed. In the distance, the husband of the allergic passenger was still holding his wife's hand, thanking the passengers around him. Linda Rowe walked by, glanced at Naomi and Sophia, but didn't ask. Perhaps she knew the conversation was no longer hers to control. Naomi returned to seat 3A, took out her phone, and wrote the last few lines in the note 12:40 p.m. Flight attendant Sophia Perez confirms the seat-lowering action originated from biased instructions from gate agent Melissa Grant. Specific statement, she's not getting a free ride in first class on my watch. Ticket is completely valid. Flag needs to be verified in the reservation system. Witness agrees to cooperate. She saved it, locked the screen, and leaned her head back in her seat. For the first time since the flight, she allowed herself to breathe a sigh of relief. Outside, dusk began to settle over the ocean. Pale light filtered through the clouds, bathing the cabin in a soft amber. Naomi smiled, not because she had won, but because she knew that all change began with a single word of truth. When the plane touched down at Los Angeles Pacific International, Naomi met Jordan Miles again on the conveyor belt. The two compared information, and right there, Naomi decided it was time to turn the tables. She turned to Linda Rowe and said, in a calm but shocking voice, I am an inspector for the Federal Transportation Oversight Agency. The sound of luggage wheels rolling on the conveyor belt was mixed with the chaotic sounds of hundreds of passengers getting off the plane. The smell of coffee, perfume, and even the plastic smell of suitcases mixed together in a very typical airport atmosphere, half tired, half hurried. Naomi stood there, neat in her dark gray pantsuit, her eyes scanning the Atlantic Star crew as they left the security area. She saw Linda Rowe step out first, her face showing tension. Behind her was Sophia Perez, her eyes still red from the conversation in the galley. From a distance, Jordan Miles approached, his black briefcase slung over his shoulder, his eyes signaling a signal only his peers in the industry understood. Enough. Now it's time to act. Naomi nodded slightly, like someone who had just finished a long report. she said softly. Anterior compartment, improper behavior, obvious favoritism. Rear compartment. Jordan replied, same pattern. I've documented at least 3 instances of discriminatory service. A white passenger asked for his drink immediately, while a black passenger had to be asked twice. No coincidence. Naomi, this is a culture, not an accident. Naomi looked at him, her eyes flashing with the cold light of someone about to lift the final curtain. Thanks, Jordan. I'll take care of the rest. She turned and walked quickly towards Linda Rowe, who was trying to avoid her gaze. Miss Rowe, Naomi called, her voice calm, but something in her tone made Linda pause. Linda turned back, forcing a smile. Oh, Miss Carter, I just wanted to say, about today's incident. Naomi interrupted, still in a voice as low and cold as the surface of steel. Yes, we will talk about that, but not as a passenger to a stewardess. You need to know who I am first. Linda raised her eyebrows slightly, not understanding. Naomi opened her wallet, took out a shiny metal ID card, and held it straight forward Federal Transportation Oversight Agency's senior auditor, Naomi Carter. The air around them froze. Linda looked at the card, then at Naomi, her face pale. You're a federal inspector. Yes, I was sent on a secret investigation into discrimination in the airline industry, and, unfortunately, your flight today was just a prime example. Linda took a half step back, trying to calm down. I was just following instructions from the gate. Melissa Grant said there was something fishy with the ticket, I know. Naomi said, interrupting gently. And I have Sophia Perez's transcript to confirm it. The problem is, you chose to believe the word of someone you knew was biased instead of following the proper procedure. Linda bowed her head, her voice low, clear with regret and fear. I didn't think things would get this serious. Not serious, Naomi asked again, still not raising her voice. You pulled a black passenger out of her seat, in front of everyone else, just because she didn't look like a first-class passenger. Do you understand what that did? Linda was silent. Between the flight announcements and the rattle of suitcases, her silence was heavy. Jordan stood behind, arms crossed, watching. Sophia Perez, a young girl standing nearby, was looking at Naomi with a mixture of admiration and fear. Naomi exhaled, then spoke slowly, each word as if stamped, I'm not here to put anyone out of a job. I'm here to prove that the system is broken, and if none of you will speak up, then I will. Linda raised her head, her eyes already wet. Miss Carter, I just want to do my job well. But Melissa has a reputation at Liberty Airport. She controls everything. I understand. Naomi interrupted, her voice softening. And I know the fear too. But what's more frightening is letting prejudice continue to dominate people who are just trying to do their job. She stopped, looking deep into Linda's eyes. The silence of those who know what is right, that is what keeps injustice going for so long. Sophia approached, her voice low. Sister Carter, I told you everything. I will cooperate with FTOA if necessary. Naomi nodded. Thank you. Sophia, I will make sure you are protected. Linda looked at the two of them, her eyes shifting from fear to recognition. Perhaps in that moment, she understood this wasn't just about a seat, but about a principle everyone deserved to be treated fairly, no matter what they looked like. Jordan opened his phone, took down a few notes, then looked at Naomi. The first step is done. What about the company? Naomi smiled softly. Tomorrow, I want them to hear it from me in the district manager's office, And I want Melissa Grant present." Jordan nodded. She probably wouldn't have expected that the person she insulted would be the one who could cause the entire company to reinvestigate its training system. "It's not revenge," Naomi said evenly. "It's justice. And true justice doesn't need to be shouted to be heard." As Naomi left the baggage area, she paused for a second. Behind her, Sophia stood still, watching. The young girl spoke softly, low enough for only Naomi to hear. "I think I learned something today." Naomi turned her head and smiled. Justice doesn't always require a loud voice. "Sophia, sometimes it just takes one person to stand up when everyone else bows their head." Then she walked away, small but straight, blending into the crowd. Behind, the loudspeaker rang out Atlantic Star Flight 472. Landing procedures complete. A chapter of justice has just ended quietly, but resoundingly, the next morning at Atlantic Star Airlines' Western Regional Headquarters in Los Angeles. Naomi and Jordan walked into a conference room. Across from them were Joseph Peterson and Andrea Lee, two senior executives waiting. On the table, Naomi placed a thick file and her badge. "Let's start," she said. "We're going to talk about Flight AS-472. The conference room was on the 12th floor of a glass-fronted building overlooking Century Boulevard. Morning sunlight filtered through sheer curtains and reflected off the dark wood tabletop. The air in the room was colder than usual, not just because of the air conditioning, but because of the presence of Naomi Carter, the woman who had been dragged from first class just 24 hours earlier, now sitting across from the decision-makers for the entire western section of the Atlantic Star. Joseph Peterson, a man in his 50s with evenly gray hair and a dignified demeanor, struggled to keep his voice neutral as he began. "Miss Carter, thank you for coming. We received a notification from FTOA about a preliminary investigation report, but we really didn't expect it from you. We are ready to cooperate fully." Naomi nodded. Beside her, Jordan opened his laptop, the screen displaying discrimination, Flight AS-472, preliminary profile. Naomi didn't beat around the bush. "I'll keep this brief. Here's a detailed account of what happened on yesterday's flight, including boarding times, crew names, words, actions, crew reactions, and any medical incidents that followed." She pushed the file toward Joseph. The paper made a dry clatter against the table. Andrea Lee, a petite female human resources manager with sharp eyes, flipped through the first few pages. Each line was a slash. "Asked for ID again, no procedure. Forced to leave boarding seat. Melissa Grant's biased comments. Slow response to medical incident," Naomi continued, her voice calm, as if reading a transcript rather than recounting a humiliation to which someone else might have reacted with anger. "According to regulations. Once a passenger's boarded and seated, only technical or security issues allow the passenger to be moved. There is no security basis in this case. The actions of gate agent Melissa Grant are a direct violation of procedure and have racial bias elements." Joseph took a deep breath and put down his pen. "I understand, and we sincerely apologize to you, Ms. Carter, on behalf of the firm. I apologize for the unprofessional behavior." Naomi didn't reply. She just looked straight ahead, her eyes showing no resentment, no forgiveness, just recognition. Jordan interjected, his voice low and clear. "Apologies are not enough. What we are looking for is not an admission of guilt, but a change in the system. Your company is not being sued for one wrongful act, but for a series of repeated wrongs, and the victims are disproportionately black passengers." Andrea raised her head, her eyes wavering. Chain of actions. What do you mean? Naomi clasped her hands in front of her. FTOA has received more than 18 reports in the past year of passengers of color being denied upgrades, asked for tickets multiple times, or removed from premium seats. 5 of those were on Atlantic Star Airlines. Do you think that's a coincidence? The room fell silent. Joseph rested his hand on his forehead, his voice hoarse. I can't say it's a coincidence. It could be a matter of training. Naomi smiled slightly, but there was no joy in that smile. No, Mr. Peterson, it's not a matter of training. It's a matter of culture. Something that's been ingrained for so long that it becomes a habit. Andrea put down the file. Her voice lowered. We will immediately suspend Melissa Grant for investigation. At the same time, we will review the entire flight crew of AS-472. FTOA can send an official request. We will cooperate. Naomi nodded. I hope so. But I also want you to understand one thing. This is not a mistake. It is a pattern of behavior directed at black passengers, especially those who don't look like they belong in first class. The words made Joseph look up, his eyes meeting Naomi's. A powerful man in the airline industry, facing a black woman speaking to him about justice not with anger, but with written truth. I understand, Joseph said slowly, and I won't deny it. I've heard similar complaints before, but nothing like this. Thank you. Ms. Carter, I'll send this report to the CEO and the ethics department, and if you need us, we'll give FTOA full access to the system. Naomi closed the file and packed up the documents. I don't need promises, I just need action. All of the airline's flights will be randomly monitored for the next 3 months. Sophia Perez will be under witness protection. I hope the airline treats her more fairly than they did me. Andrea nodded, her voice sincere. We will do just that. Miss Perez was the first to speak out. And Miss Carter, you made us listen. Naomi stood up, ready to leave. She knew the fight wouldn't end here, but this was the first point where justice stepped in, silent, but firm. Before leaving the room, Joseph called out Miss Carter. You're not angry, although you have every right to be. Why? Naomi paused, her hand on the doorknob. She turned, the light from the window falling on her face, making her voice ring out like a reminder. Because I don't need to shout to be heard. When the truth is clear enough, it will speak. That same afternoon, Naomi received a call from Sophia Perez. Sophia's voice was hoarse and worried. Ms. Carter, they want me to sign another statement saying that this was just a small misunderstanding, but I can't do that. Naomi knew that this investigation was far from over, but she also knew that justice was beginning to speak its mind. Naomi listened quietly for a moment, the only sound being the wind blowing in through the thin curtains from the hotel window in Los Angeles. Outside, the sunset was slowly falling on the traffic-filled streets, the orange light of the sun dyeing the room a golden yellow. She gently placed her cup of coffee on the table and said in a calm voice, "Calm down. Sophia, what did they say to you?" On the other end of the line, Sophia took a deep breath, her voice trembling but determined. The manager told me to just write that there was a misunderstanding between the passenger and the gate agent, that there was no racial bias involved. They said if I signed, they would consider keeping my job after the investigation was over. Naomi closed her eyes and let out a soft breath she had expected it. And how did you answer? I said no. Sophia replied, her voice growing stronger. I can't. I saw it. I heard it. And I know it's wrong. Melissa Grant doesn't just do it to you. Carter. She has a whole routine at Liberty." Naomi opened her notebook and took out a pen to quickly jot down a few lines. She asked slowly, as if afraid to make Sophia hesitate, "Can you be more specific?" "Sophia, what exactly do you mean, at Liberty?" Sophia said, "Melissa has a reputation for being fierce. She doesn't touch you if you're a regular, a white businessman, or someone who looks like you're first-class worthy. But if you're black, or if you're not dressed the way she thinks you are, she starts asking more questions, checking ID, checking tickets, asking about credit cards. I once saw her say to a black man, 'First class might not be the place for you.' He just laughed and walked away. No one dared to react. Naomi stopped writing. She looked up at the window, where the sun was nearly set, the last light casting soft orange hues across her face, and no one on the team said anything. "No," Sophia said softly, "because Melissa is close to some of the ground managers. Anyone who dares to argue with her will be transferred or get a lower score on the test. As for flight attendants like me, we just listen to her orders." Naomi was silent. That was what she was looking for, not just an individual fault, but a system of silence that fostered injustice. "Sophia," Naomi said, her voice soft and clear, "you did the right thing by telling the truth, but now you have to be careful. I want to connect you with an FTOA lawyer for your protection. No one has the right to force you to sign or make false statements. If they pressure you, you must tell me immediately. I'm afraid they'll fire me." "If they do," Naomi replied, "they will face the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Labor at the same time. Believe me, you are not alone." Sophia was silent for a few seconds, then said softly, almost chokingly, "Carter, I've never seen anyone like you. Yesterday, I thought you would get angry, yell, 'Sue,' but you took notes, observed, and then spoke in a way that made people listen. Now I understand that is why you do this job." Naomi smiled softly, her voice warm and sad. "I did it not because I was stronger. Sophia, I did it because I was like you, afraid to speak up, afraid to lose my job, afraid to be labeled a troublemaker. But then I realized silence is also a form of complicity." Sophia took a deep breath, seeming to regain her courage. "Then you just talk to FTOA's lawyer. I will tell you everything. Not just your case, but also the previous cases." Naomi wrote down Sophia's phone number, then texted Jordan. "There's an inside witness. Urgent protection required. Prepare an investigation file for Liberty Station." Jordan replied almost immediately. "Yes, legal request filed. Be careful. Naomi, the company may respond." She closed her phone and leaned back in her seat. In that quiet moment, Naomi remembered Melissa Grant's face, the cold gaze, the smug smile as she pulled her from first class. Now, it was only a matter of time before the light reached that darkness. 3 days later, in an email to FTOA, Sophia formally submitted her testimony. She listed at least 4 instances where she had witnessed Melissa Grant harassing black passengers at Liberty International. One of them was a doctor. Another was a veteran people who had served this country, but were being disrespected in their own airport. Naomi read each line, her eyes stinging slightly. She wasn't surprised anymore, just sad, for stories like this weren't uncommon. But this time, there was proof, there were names, there were dates, and there were witnesses who were telling the truth. She sent back a short message to Sophia. You just did the best thing anyone could do in this profession. Don't worry, we'll be there for you." Sophia simply responded with a small emoji. Late afternoon. Naomi stood in front of the hotel window, watching the planes take off from the runway, each one like a chance given a chance to make the world a little more fair. If only someone would dare to speak up. Jordan walked in, carrying a new folder. "Good news," he said. "FTOA has approved a full investigation into discriminatory behavior by Liberty Airport employees. They want you to take the lead." Naomi looked at him, then at the sky. "The world needs more people like Sophia," she said softly. "People who dare to speak out, even if their voices tremble." Jordan smiled. "And we need more people like you. Naomi, people who listen without judgment." She responded with a tired but relieved smile. "No, Jordan, I'm just telling the truth. But sometimes telling the truth is the bravest thing to do." That evening, Naomi received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Liberty Gate footage. Watch before it's deleted." Inside was a security video of Melissa Grant saying to another employee, "Not again. Another black passenger in first class. They should know their place." Naomi stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she called Jordan. "We have proof." 3 weeks later, things were different. The FTOA's official internal investigation report was released, more than 120 pages long, with a series of concrete evidence log files, testimony, videos, meeting minutes, all leading to the same name, Melissa Grant, a gate agent at New York Liberty International. Naomi sat in the FTOA branch office in D.C. In front of her was a screen displaying newly decoded data from Atlantic Star Airlines' reservation system. Beside her, Jordan Miles flipped through the files, his voice low. "There it is. She manually flagged your ticket as suspected fraudulent. Naomi, there were no previous reports of fraud from the system. She simply saw your name and did it." Naomi stared at the words flagged by user M. Grant 412. She said nothing for a few seconds, just nodded slightly. "I guessed right. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional." Jordan folded the file and leaned back in his chair. "I've never seen an airline trigger a crisis like this before. You know, this morning the video leaked. People are talking about the woman in seat 3A. Naomi smiled slightly, not the smile of victory, but of someone who understood that the truth had finally spoken for itself. "I never needed them to know my name," she said, "just for them to see the story." 2 days later, social media exploded. A snippet from the surveillance video was shared more than 1.5 million times in just 24 hours. In it, Melissa Grant can be seen leaning over and saying to a coworker, "Check her ID again. She doesn't look like first class." Comments flooded in below the video. "It's 2025 and this is still happening. Justice comes in silence. Who is she? I want the Atlantic Star to answer right away." On the evening news, the anchors brought up the incident as a prime example of implicit bias in the airline industry. No one knew Naomi Carter was an undercover federal inspector, at least not yet. But everyone knew her as the calm woman who didn't yell, but changed everything. At Atlantic Star Airlines headquarters, the real storm began. In an emergency meeting with regional managers, Joseph Peterson presented a summary of the FTOA report. The first sentence he said brought silence to the room. "We did not fail because of one wrong employee. We failed because of making mistakes a habit." Andrea Lee, the human resources manager, read the disciplinary decision. Melissa Grant, fired immediately, with a record of serious breach of professional ethics. Linda Rowe, placed under supervision and required to participate in retraining on non-discriminatory service procedures. Sophia Perez, promoted to Flight Service Coordinator, noted for cooperative attitude and courageous reporting of the truth. The company's press release was issued the same afternoon. We apologize to the passenger involved in the incident on Flight AS-472. Atlantic Star has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Disciplinary steps and process improvements have been taken, but the public was not so quick to forget. The story spread further when a passenger whose wife had an allergic reaction on that flight filed a lawsuit against the airline for the delayed medical response. The lawsuit cited the FTOA itself, stating the flight attendant was trained to respond according to priority procedures, but chose to serve the VIP cabin first. The media juxtaposed two stories: a black woman kicked out of first class, and a white woman who nearly lost her life because of a delay in getting help. Both were victims of the same disease, systemic arrogance, and prejudice. Naomi watched it all from afar. She made no news appearances, made no voice online. For her, the mission was accomplished, and just as she believed true justice requires no noise. That afternoon, Jordan walked into the office with 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of Naomi and said, "You know, I just heard Sophia was chosen as the internal representative for the company's new training program. They're calling it Equality at 30,000 feet. Naomi smiled softly, her eyes warming slightly. "I'm not surprised. She understands what it means to stand tall in a storm." Jordan was silent for a moment and then asked, "What about you?" "Will you write a summary report?" "I will," Naomi replied, "but not to close the file. I want it to be used in industry-wide training, to remind people that just one look, one misplaced word, can change someone's destiny." That evening, Naomi headed to the airport for her flight back to Washington. As she passed the first-class boarding area, she paused for a second. A young female gate agent, new, perhaps just on the job, smiled and greeted her sincerely. "Good evening." "Ma'am." "Enjoy your flight." Naomi nodded, responding with a slight smile. "Thank you." Just 2 words, but to her, they carried the meaning of long days of silent fighting. The plane taxied down the runway, from seat 3A. Naomi looked out the window, the lights of Los Angeles fading away. She closed her eyes and thought to herself justice had taken flight once again. The next morning, as Naomi landed in Washington, her phone rang. A message from an unknown number: "Miss Carter. This is the attorney for Atlantic Star. The board wants to meet with you in person to discuss cooperation in reforming service policy. They say only you can help them understand what true fairness is." Naomi looked at the screen and smiled slightly. "Perhaps," she whispered, "this is the most important part." 3 weeks later, at a press conference in Washington, D.C., the FTOA officially announced its ruling. Atlantic Star Airlines was fined $2,000 for violating fair service and non-discrimination rules in the aviation industry. At the same time, all frontline employees from gate agents, flight crews, to supervisors must attend mandatory diversity awareness training, directly supervised by FTOA. The news was all over the evening news, not just because of the large fine, but because of the reason behind it. A black woman was kicked out of first class. But it turned out to be federal inspectors inspecting their own. In the FTOA office, Jordan Miles stood next to Naomi, holding up his phone. New message from the commissioner. People say this result will set a precedent for the entire industry. Congratulations, Naomi. You just changed the system." Naomi smiled slightly. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at the screen that displayed the words, "Atlantic Star accepts responsibility, vows reform." "It wasn't me, Jordan," she said after a moment. "It was all the people who were overlooked. I was just lucky to have the chance to do the right thing." Jordan shrugged, half joking. "You make it sound so simple, but so many others have had the chance and no one else has taken it. You turned it into a system change. Do you think people will remember that Naomi looked out the window where the morning sun shone on buildings draped in American flags? Maybe no one remembers my name," she replied. "But if the next time a black woman gives me a first-class ticket and I don't ask her to stand aside, that's enough." 2 days later, Naomi was at Denver International Airport, preparing for her next business trip. She was on her way to Seattle, another unannounced inspection, but this time with a smaller airline. The airport was bustling as usual, the loudspeakers calling for flights mixed with the clatter of suitcases being dragged, the chatter of laughter. Naomi was still wearing her familiar dark pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a bun, walking slowly through the first-class check-in area. A young female employee looked up and smiled at her. "Good morning, Ms. Carter. Your ticket is seat 2A. Correct?" Naomi nodded slightly. "Right." The clerk scanned the ticket in less than 2 seconds. No scrutinizing looks, no requests to see ID, no unnecessary questions. She simply said, "Have a great flight, and thank you for choosing our airline." Naomi replied with a warm smile, "Thank you." She walked through the security gate, feeling lighter. The officer might not have known he was part of a big change, but to Naomi, it was a sign justice was becoming routine. In first class, Naomi sat in seat 2A when the flight attendant came over to offer her a drink. She smiled and accepted the cup of black coffee, placing her phone on the small table. A message from Jordan appeared. Jordan FTOA just sent out an official statement. The $2 million fine has been collected. Atlantic Star signed an industry-wide training agreement. We've made it. Naomi. It's a long way off, Jordan, but at least today I can drink my coffee in peace." She leaned her head back against the seat, listening to the engine begin to rev. Out the window, the sky opened up, endlessly blue. In that moment, Naomi felt clearly that every act of justice, however small, could create ripples far beyond a single flight, an airline, or an individual incident. A week later, the press began talking about the Seat 3A effect, how a seemingly small incident forced the entire U.S. airline industry to re-examine how it treated passengers. An article in The Atlantic stated she doesn't shout, she doesn't get angry. She takes notes, listens, and waits for the right moment to speak. She doesn't need power because the truth is strong enough to speak for itself. At the end of the article, the journalist added, "If you ever see someone greeted with a smile instead of suspicion, there are probably still footprints of the woman in seat 3A somewhere." Late that afternoon, Naomi stopped at a small cafe in the Seattle airport. The sunset, streaming through the glass windows, illuminating her hand as she held a cup of hot coffee. A group of passengers at a nearby table were discussing the Atlantic Star affair. One of them said, "It's hard to believe that something like that still happens today." The other replied, "Maybe, thanks to people like her, that will happen less." Naomi heard and only smiled. She said nothing, did not introduce herself. She just stood quietly, preparing for her next journey. Because her job had never been about recognition, it was about making sure no one else had to go through what she had gone through. The plane took off that evening in a light Seattle rain. Naomi opened her notebook and wrote the last line of her report. Not being silent about a seemingly small act can change the way an airline treats passengers of color. Then she closed the notebook and looked out the window. The city lights blurred in the rain, but in her heart, justice was brighter than ever. The sky outside was dark, but the light streaks from the plane's wings cast long, brush strokes across the night sky. Naomi sat silently, her eyes following the hazy sky. Each flight had its own story, but for her, this was more than just work. It was a journey to find justice in places where justice seemed unnecessary. On the cabin, the flight attendants walked around lightly, the sound of metal trays clanking softly. A young blonde girl stopped next to Naomi, smiling. "Would you like more coffee?" Naomi looked up. Her smile was natural, without a hint of defense or doubt. She nodded slightly. "Yes, thank you." It was a small act, but for Naomi, it carried the weight of a journey. No one looked at her with judgment anymore. No one was surprised anymore that a black woman sat in the front row. She sipped her coffee, tasting the bitterness mixed with a hint of sweetness on the tip of her tongue, a taste she had always thought of as a symbol of justice. Unpleasant, but awakening. The phone in his pocket vibrated. It was a text message from Jordan Miles. "Carter, your report was selected as the official textbook for industry-wide anti-racism training. They call it the 3A case." Naomi reread the message, her lips curling into a quiet smile. The 3A case not for her, but for the compartment that had once been a symbol of exclusion, now a symbol of change. She remembered the face of Sophia Perez, the young flight attendant who had trembled when she decided to tell the truth. Without Sophia, justice would have remained in pages that no one would read. Naomi thought to herself, justice comes not only from those in power, but also from those who dare to admit the truth. As the plane passed through the clouds, Naomi tilted her head slightly, allowing the light from the dashboard to illuminate the worn notebook. On the last page, she wrote another line not for the report, but for herself. Don't despise small things. Every look, every word, every decision is a measure of character. She knew the Atlantic Star incident wasn't unique, but it was a starting point. After the $2 million fine, a number of other airlines began to review their procedures. A chain reaction was underway. Maybe they were doing it out of fear of being fined. But Naomi believed if only a few of them understood the real reason, the world would be a little better. A month later, Naomi was invited to speak behind closed doors at an internal meeting of major airline representatives. The meeting room, located on the 20th floor of FTOA headquarters, was so quiet that one could hear pens touching paper. When Naomi walked in, the atmosphere suddenly became tense. Everyone knew her as the woman in seat 3A. She did not hold a speech. She simply stood up straight, looked around the room, and said in a soft, even, but far-reaching voice, "I'm not here to recount that incident. I just want to talk about a look." The room was silent. Naomi continued slowly. Suspicious glances, judgmental glances, glances that give themselves the right to judge where others should sit. Those glances are small, seemingly harmless, but they create a culture, and that culture, once ingrained, will cause the whole system to collapse in the face of one wrong action. She paused for a beat, then spoke more softly, almost in a whisper. Justice does not begin in a court of law. It begins the moment we choose to treat people who are different from us fairly. No one applauded. There was just a silence, heavy but real. It was the kind of silence Naomi was familiar with, the silence of awareness. After the meeting, an airline executive approached her. He was white, with silver hair and a worldly appearance. "Carter," he said, "I've flown all my life and never thought that one small action at the gate could bring down an entire airline. Thank you for making us look again." Naomi just smiled, not to look back, but to remember that everyone deserves respect. On the flight back, Naomi looked around the first-class cabin faces of all colors, genders, and ages. No one was special, and no one had to prove they deserved to be there. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady sound of the engine like a heartbeat. Part of her had learned that victory was not about punishing the wrongdoer, but about making society no longer tolerate that wrongdoing. Before the plane descended, Naomi took out her phone and opened the last text message from Jordan. "The 3A case will be included in FTOA training materials. I think the woman in seat 3A did what many people dare not do, made the whole world stop, just to see what is right." Naomi didn't reply. She just let the screen light up, then smiled slightly. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. Light streamed in, dyeing the entire row of seats golden. Naomi whispered softly, as if talking to herself, as if talking to the world. Not remaining silent in the face of a seemingly small act can change the way people look at each other. The story of the woman in seat 3A is more than just a case of discrimination on a flight. It's a reminder that real power lies not in where you sit, but in how you respond to insults. Naomi Carter, the woman who was forced out of her first-class seat, chose wisdom over anger, chose recognition over argument, and it was that calmness that forced a system to change. From the small act of a prejudiced gate agent to the courageous decision of a flight attendant to speak her mind, every piece of the puzzle adds up to a picture of justice. It shows we don't need to shout to be heard. We just need to be strong enough not to be silent. In life, you may encounter people who look down on you because of the color of your skin, the voice you speak, or the way you look. But don't let their contempt define you. Maintain your dignity, because respecting yourself is the foundation of all justice. Thank you for following this story. If you believe the world needs more people like Naomi, people who choose justice over anger, please like, share this video to spread the message, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories of kindness, social awareness, and justice told with heart.